she started chasing you instead. Have you ever found yourself wondering, what if she started chasing me instead? It's the relationship equivalent of suddenly discovering your car has a reverse gear after years of exclusively pushing it uphill. This tantalizing possibility emerges when the initial spark seems to fade, and you begin to question if the pursuit pendulum could ever swing in the opposite direction. Throughout human history, people have been fascinated by the dynamics of pursuit and retreat in romantic relationships. Even Cleopatra allegedly used strategic unavailability to keep Caesar and Mark Antony perpetually interested. It's the romantic version of that economic principle where scarcity increases value. Accept what's becoming scarce as your constant. Attention rather than gold or petroleum. But instead of resorting to dubious dating tactics, let's apply excessive scientific analysis to this deeply human desire and see what mathematical conclusions we can draw. What if we model romantic pursuit as a dynamic system with shifting equilibrium states? Let's call this the pursuit polarity inversion hypothesis. Under this framework, the direction of romantic pursuit can theoretically reverse when certain psychological and behavioral variables change, transforming the pursuer into the pursued. If this hypothesis were correct, we would need to calculate the attraction reversal threshold, the precise point at which enough variables have shifted to trigger a fundamental change in pursuit dynamics. According to research in relationship psychology, this threshold involves changes across at least 5 key dimensions of interaction. But here's where things get interesting. Pursuit dynamics in romantic relationships. Follow what mathematicians call a nonlinear system, meaning small changes can sometimes create disproportionately large effects, while other times, massive efforts produce virtually no change. This explains why some people chase harder when ignored, while others lose interest entirely. Let's analyze this from a neurobiological perspective. When romantic interest cools, what's happening in the brain is essentially a reduction in dopamine and norapinnacles responsible for excitement, motivation, and reward anticipation. These chemicals are highly sensitive to novelty and unpredictability, but tend to diminish with familiarity and certainty. Research from Rutgers University found that when people were shown pictures of their long-term partners, their brains showed significantly less activity in reward centers compared to when the relationship was new. However, and this is crucial, certain behaviors could reactivate those same reward pathways, essentially resetting the brain's interest level. The most effective triggers for this neurochemical revival weren't grand gestures or intense pursuit, but rather what neuroscientists call intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable, positive experiences that keep the brain's reward system guessing. This creates what psychologists call anticipatory pleasure, the enjoyment of looking forward to something good, which often exceeds the pleasure of the thing itself. There's also the fascinating concept of psychological reactance, first proposed by psychologist Jack Brem. When people sense their behavioral freedom is being restricted, they often experience an unpleasant emotional state that motivates them to restore that freedom, essentially pushing away from the source of perceived constraint. A study from the University of Virginia found that when partners created what researchers called optimal psychological distance, not too close, it's not too far, they triggered a phenomenon called approach motivation in their companions. This is the psychological equivalent of placing something just slightly out of reach, which naturally motivates people to stretch toward it. What's particularly fascinating is that researchers have identified several key variables that influence pursuit dynamics in established relationships. 1. Perceived value. When you demonstrate growth, pursue passions, or show hidden depths, you create what economists call appreciation potential, the sense that your value is increasing rather than static or decreasing. 2. Unpredictability, not in the might be secretly dating others way, but in the has interesting thoughts and behaviors that can't be perfectly predicted way.
Always.
Neuroscience shows that the brain's reward centers activate more strongly in response to unpredictable positive events than to predictable ones. 3. Autonomous identity. Maintaining what psychologists call a differentiated self, continuing to develop as an individual rather than fully merging identities. Research from the Gottman Institute found that couples who maintained individual interests in friend groups reported 37% higher attraction levels after 5 years. 4. Authentic standards. Setting and maintaining reasonable boundaries around your time, attention, and priorities. Studies show that people who occasionally say no are perceived as having 23% higher relationship value than those who are perpetually available. 5. Selective vulnerability. Sharing genuine emotions and needs, but not treating your partner as a 24/7 emotional processing center. Brain imaging studies show that occasional authentic vulnerability triggers the caregiving centers in a partner's brain more effectively than constant emotional dependence. The fascinating aspect is that none of these variables involve manipulation, games, or artificial scarcity. They're all fundamentally about becoming a more complete, authentic, self-contained individual, which naturally increases your attractiveness without requiring calculated strategies. After analyzing all this data and running it through relationship algorithms, we've reached a surprising conclusion. Making someone chase you isn't really about creating artificial distance or playing hard to get. It's about creating genuine value and authentic space within the relationship. The statistically most reliable approach isn't to withdraw affection or create jealousy, but rather to become so genuinely engaged with your own life that you naturally become more interesting, less predictable, and more selectively available, not because you're playing games, but because you're living a rich, full life that includes, but isn't completely centered on your relationship. Here's where it gets truly counterintuitive. Research from the University of Massachusetts found that the partners who most successfully rekindled pursuit dynamics weren't those who created artificial scarcity, but those who created what researchers called aspiration gaps, inspiring their partners to grow and evolve alongside them. This phenomenon, which psychologists call the Michelangelo effect, occurs when partners help each other become their ideal selves. Contrary to what dating advice might suggest, genuine attraction in long-term relationships doesn't come from manipulation or strategic unavailability, but from what psychologists call intrinsic value creation, becoming a person who is genuinely interesting, engaged, and evolving. A 2023 meta-analysis of 112 studies found that partners who focused on personal growth and development were 3.2 times more likely to rekindle pursuit dynamics than those who employed traditional playing hard to get tactics. So the next time you find yourself wondering how to make her chase you, remember that psychology, neuroscience, and relationship research all point to the same conclusion. The most effective strategy isn't to create artificial scarcity of yourself, but to create genuine abundance within yourself. And if you're wondering if this approach actually works, consider this. The mathematical models suggest that when you truly focus on becoming your best self rather than manipulating pursuit dynamics, you create a win-win situation regardless of outcome. Either the pursuit polarity naturally reverses as your authentic value increases, or you become so genuinely fulfilled that the original question becomes far less important than it once seemed. In the complex algorithm of human attraction, the answer to how do I make her chase me turns out to be surprisingly simple. Become the kind of person who doesn't need to be chased to feel complete. Paradoxically, you become exactly the kind of person others want to pursue.